This budget hearing, conducted by the Committee on Appropriation and Adjudication, will now reconvene with the Guam Department of Education. I want to thank my colleagues for joining me today, the Vice Speaker, the Oversight Chair, Senator Snogestein, and Senator Camacho-Torres. I want to thank everyone for your presence here today. As we continue the budget process for fiscal year 2019, we face overwhelming challenges due to the Trump Tax Act impact on the government of Guam's revenue stream. Given such austere times, we found it prudent that the Committee on Appropriations have a different tone and appropriation to the budget hearings. The continued implication that past patterns of appropriation levels will no longer be taken as a given. Prior to this hearing, I sent a letter to each agency asking that you provide testimony. In prior fiscal years, the committee had taken an incremental budget approach and requested your agency to justify any additional funding above your existing funding levels. For this fiscal year, we are engaging in what I loosely term zero-based budgeting, which does not start with the prior year's fiscal year funding to justify next year's fiscal year funding level. Rather, we take a deeper look into each agency's budget from the ground up. Given the likelihood of decreased revenues from which to fund government services to our people, we must take a closer look at each and every agency of the government of Guam and not be bound by what we have provided in the past. Some may have Googled ZBB and found that there is no true consensus on which zero-based budgeting is operationalized. I want to clarify to everyone that the zero-based budgeting approach the committee intends on taking is more of a shift in mindset. And as we continue this budget process, the public should be aware that what was provided for in the past is not what the committee will be solely basing decisions on for the future. The committee is doing everything it can to show the people of Guam that what we are committing to a ground-up approach because the current fiscal environment calls for it. With that said, I invite the Department of Education to make its presentation today. Do I understand the President? Chairman, Mr. Mignola, you'll make opening statement.
Good morning, Honorable Senators, Mr. Speaker, Vice Speaker, members of the Guam Legislature. Hafide, I come before you today representing the Guam Education Board. I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify on the Guam Education Board's FY 2019 budget request for the Guam Department of Education. Every year, we come before you with a budget request in excess of $300 million, and this year is no different. We arrived at this request this year. The request for FY 2019 is at $334 million. After much consultation with our stakeholders, including our students, educators, staff, and administrators, we believe it reflects what is needed to meet our core mission and responsibility under the law. We understand the financial situation facing the government today. This is why, under the leadership of the superintendent earlier this year, GDOE was the first agency to begin reducing our budget in order to demonstrate the type of responsibility and prudence needed in the time of crisis. We also were very transparent, bringing our ideas for further reductions out to the community and listening to their concerns and suggestions. We are pleased that the governor and the legislature came to an agreement with Public Law 34-87, which stabilized the government and provided facilities funding for GDOE. As we come before you today, knowing that we are still facing revenue challenges brought by the federal tax cuts, and knowing that many of you are contemplating a repeal of the sales tax, we ask that you find a way to support public education and GDOE. We won't tell you how to do it, but we will say that we need your support in making sure education is a priority, even during these times of financial distress. Our schools and our families need your continued support. Our superintendent is prepared to present the details of our budget, and we stand ready to support him and our schools and divisions who have helped to shape the request before you today. Situas Masi.
Day, Mr. Speaker, and members of the committee. Before I get started, I wanted to just to let you know who's in the room. We do have our members for the board, of course, the deputies. So some of the deputies may be called should they be needed to answer questions, and they've been sworn in, as well as our division heads and school administrators. I thought it would be great to, as we've done in the past, to have them here directly. Some of the issues, concerns, and suggestions that obviously come out of these discussions as we head into FY19's budget. On behalf of the Guam Department of Education, our administrators, teachers, division heads, staff, students, and family, I want to thank you for this opportunity to provide testimony on the department's fiscal year 2019 budget request. Now, all of you should have a narrative that was sent in earlier, which is basically outlines in detail how this request is constructed and with the underlying numbers. This testimony is really meant to be more of a high-level executive summary of how we got to this request. Obviously, in September of last year, we issued the budget call to start the process for generating this request. Public hearings were held throughout the island to seek input from public school stakeholders regarding the FY19 budget. And these requests from the schools and divisions are presented to the superintendent, then to the Guam Education Board in early January 2018, and a final budget proposal was approved on January 26, 2018 at a special board meeting. This budget request is captured in Guam Education Board Resolution 2018-02, which was transmitted to your office, Mr. Speaker, at the end of January, as required by law. It reflects a request of $334.7 million, which is a 3.3% increase over the amount requested in 18, and a 41% increase over the FY18 actual appropriation approved by the Guam legislature last year. Let me take a moment to clarify that this does not include the requests of the charter schools. The charter schools are normally required to submit their budgets to the board to be included in the budget process. We did work with the council to try to get that information in. That information was submitted the same day that the board voted on the DOE budget, but we transmitted the charter school budgets to the legislature under separate cover and informed you that that was not included in the $334.7 million request. So I just wanted to clarify that so we can, if that becomes a question. In February 2018, shortly after the resolution was transmitted, the government of Guam was faced with a significant challenge regarding the FY18 budget, given the projected revenue losses as a result of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017. Out of concern for the impacts on our operations and personnel, I immediately implemented $12 million in budget cuts, including postponement of early childhood education, pre-kindergarten expansion, textbook purchases, teacher reclassifications, hiring of substitutes for school year 2018 and 19. We also imposed a freeze in recruitment for central office and school administrator vacancies. Now, we had already had a central office hiring freeze for most of the fiscal year, actually going all the way back to fiscal year 2017, but we extended it to cover school administrator positions. And then we also doubled down to try to reduce utility consumption, and then redirected all available funds towards core operations. So these are funds that had previously been designated for libraries, health physical activities, sports facility repairs, and then also reduce the scope and cost of essential contracts, including things like the custodial contracts in our schools. While these reductions help mitigate disruptions to students and classroom instruction in the middle of the school year, the targeted amount that was given to us by the Bureau of Budget Management and Research was actually closer to $19 million, leaving DOE with $7 million and further reductions needed. So we went out into the community in late February, March, and April to share our situation with public school stakeholders and to receive their input and suggestions. As a result of these discussions, we developed Phase 2 and Phase 3 reduction plans, as well as a list of revenue enhancements to help offset the prospect of making further cuts. These additional reductions range from postponing the start of the school year for 2018-2019, postponing the purchase of special education buses, freezing hiring even at the school level, halting after-school activities, releasing limited-term employees, and implementing employee furloughs. So this debate, of course, was very public, and it was part of our discussion. However, on the revenue side, we also looked at other opportunities. So we had earlier proposed that the government utilize the Tejan headquarters to reduce the number of agencies leasing in the private market and to apply those savings to DOE. We asked the legislature for authority to vacate and lease our existing PD properties for commercial purposes so that those revenues could be dedicated to textbooks, instructional supplies, and maintenance needs. and that a limited increase to the business privilege tax be considered in order to support repair and renovation of public school facilities. So I know there's been a lot said about the tax increases, but I wanted to clarify that this is something that I put on the table back in my State of Education address back in December, focused really on the facility investment that I thought was something we could address at the time in order to address our $90 million in deferred maintenance and other needs. Fortunately, after months of debate, or after weeks of debate in February and March, the legislature passed and the governor signed what became Public Law 3487, which implemented the temporary 1% increase in the business privilege tax through the end of 2018 to help stabilize government finances, a 2% sales tax effective October 1 to assist in stabilizing the budget in FY19, as well as provide $10 million a year in dedicated funding for school facility improvements, and also enacted a framework for the governor to use to restructure government in a way that would reflect the island's three main priorities of education, health, and public safety. This compromise enabled us to forego more austerity and disruption in our school system, provided a welcome opportunity to help fix and renovate school buildings for years to come. As we come to this budget hearing, we are well aware of the discussion happening regarding the possible repeal of the sales tax, and as we have stressed in the past, it is the prerogative of the legislature to set tax policy. However, it is our hope and expectation as you consider the FY19 budget that you will follow through with the debate that occurred earlier this year, implement the framework set forth in Public Law 3487 in terms of prioritizing appropriations for key government services, such as public education, and help us address the needs of the public school system, including dedicated funding for the repair of school facilities. We ask this on behalf of the many stakeholders in our department. Understanding the financial situation of the government going into this coming fiscal year, we were informed that the committee would be engaging in a zero-based budgeting approach, requiring us to justify the entire budget request and not just the additional funding being requested for the year. So as part of this review, we look closely at our core responsibilities and mission as set forth in law. Those responsibilities and mission are set forth in the Organic Act prior to the sections that establish the executive branch, the legislative branch, and judicial branch. Is subsection 1, which mandates that the government of Guam provide an adequate public educational system, and to that end, establish and maintain and operate public schools according to the laws of Guam. Guam laws further clarify this mandate through the language of Public Law 2845, which was signed into law on June 13, 2005 by Governor Felix Camacho. Public Law 28-45, otherwise known as the Every Child is Entitled to an Adequate Education Act, was initially introduced by Senator Bob Klitsky, Senator Larry Kasperbauer, and Speaker Mark Forbes. At passage, it gained the additional support of current Governor Eddie Bozacalvo, current Lieutenant Governor Ray Tenorio, our current Speaker B.J. Cruz, Senator Frank Uggan, former Senator Lou Leon Guerrero, and others in a unanimous vote in favor. The law outlines 14 specific mandates for providing an adequate public education, which are spelled out further down in our testimony. The law also sets forth certain responsibilities and obligations for BBMR, the Superintendent, the Guam Education Board, the Department of Administration, and the legislature in carrying out the requirements of the law. For the legislature specifically, the obligation is to appropriate, quote, all amounts necessary to provide an adequate public education system. Finally, but importantly, Public Law 28-45 provides public school students with the right to sue the government to enforce the Adequate Education Act. As we consider the government's financial condition, those of us who stand to be made the focal point of any potential lawsuit must remember that the law states that, quote, the lack of funding or failure to release allotments shall not constitute a defense to claims under this section unless the named respondent, before commencement of the claim under this section, files an action to release such funding against the responsible party withholding such funds or allotments. That is, a lack of funding is no bar to enforcement of the Adequate Education Act. Recognizing the priority given to education in the Organic Act and in Public Law 28-45, we come to you then with a presentation of our budget request in line with the 14-point mandates. You will find some adjustments to the 14-point table that was contained in the initial resolution transmitted by the board as we worked over the past few weeks to ensure that we properly aligned our requests in terms of justifying the needs. So you have a table in the testimony that is also replicated with much greater detail in the narrative. But each of these points actually reflects the 14 points that are outlined in public law. 28-45 and breaks them out in terms of personnel, operations, utilities, and capital improvements. As the legislature reviews and decides on the budget request presented today, we also continue to seek support for the prioritization of dedicated funding for facilities. This investment will enable the department to pursue a number of important initiatives and savings while addressing key school needs. If I could just pause right there, when we were considering the potential of the stream of funding that would come in from this new sales tax, the understanding was that it would help to offset some of the requests that are being made in the budget request. So it's not necessarily on top. In our budget request, we have an amount that's been put forth in terms of capital improvement needs. So any funding that would have come in from this stream, we would have looked at offsetting the budget request that's before you today. So the reason why we continue to just stress the need for this dedicated funding, wherever it comes from, is for the following reasons. Number one, I think as you know, and as we have been working to try to address the deferred maintenance that is challenging our school system. Back in 2013, we can cite the $90 million in deferred maintenance the Army Corps of Engineers documented. Since then, we've been able to dedicate some of our ARA funds that we previously had, as well as DOI funds in a very limited fashion. I think it's $5 million over 5 years that DOI will be able to contribute. But there still leaves a lot of unmet needs that continue to fluctuate and grow without the steady commitment to maintenance. Number two, investing in capital improvement projects, unlike the other issues that have been discussed here at the legislature, is not meant to be an offset to funding losses in operations. It's really meant as an investment that we think will generate economic activity through business opportunities for vendors, jobs and wages for employees, and spending in the community by these employees. Number three, we think there are opportunities to leverage dedicated funding through partnerships with agencies like the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The USDA Rural Development Program came in last month, and we were able to talk to them about opportunities to use a dedicated stream of funding to leverage USDA support over the long term, given their ability to underwrite major renovation projects and other community facility improvements. And then the final point, there does not appear to be any funding available to kickstart the Simon Sanchez High School renovation, which was placed under GDOE control last month. Funding for Simon Sanchez High School was supposed to come from available TEF revenues. Upon receiving the authority to proceed with procurement, we were inquired with BBMR to determine the amount available for Simon Sanchez High School. We're told that all TEF funds had been appropriated for other purposes. So we asked that a direct appropriation be made to fund the renovation of Simon Sanchez and allow us to move forward with commencing design of the facility. Now, I want to stress, when we debated this legislation, we understand that there were revenues that were supposed to be set aside to finance the long-term pledge on the lease back of the Simon Sanchez facility. What we had asked in amending the legislation was flexibility to use whatever revenues were accumulating in that fund to be able to use to be able to do some of the A&E work at the front end. So we immediately went to BBMR to clarify how much they had collected that could be dedicated to this, and we were told that those funds are not available. So we do want to work with the legislature in any which way to figure out how we are going to move forward with that project. Right now, the project there was a lawsuit in court that has been dismissed. My understanding is it's with the OPA. We're not allowed to move on it yet until the OPA takes action one way or the other on the pending case. And then, but by the time we get to the ability to move forward, we want to make sure we're clear on the funding issues. Lastly, we also asked for support in a number of revenue generating initiatives with proceeds dedicated to GDOE operations, including like we said before, the authority to lease the PD warehouse and reinvest those proceeds back into DOE. I know we suggested looking at some of those tobacco products or e-cigarette products that are not yet subject to the same taxes that tobacco might be. And then reinvesting the savings from installation of solar panels in our leased back schools. This is something that we've been working on that continues to be held over at the Attorney General's office, and we're hoping that their review will be finalized very shortly. But this project has been under works for about two and a half years. So it's something that we're very eager for the Attorney General to help really give us an opportunity to move forward. So again, in closing, we ask for your support for the budget request. We welcome the discussion today. I think as we've gone out through this difficult fiscal time and talking with our stakeholders, we understand that we have a community that's willing to work together somehow, some way, whatever the situation is, to support our kids and give them opportunities for a better future. We come to you on their behalf and look forward to working with you. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I conclude my testimony.
Thank you very much. I hope all my colleagues have received the GDOE budget narrative at this point. This request for 334, you mentioned in your testimony that the fiscal realignment plan caused you to reduce your operations by how much? How much did you reduce your operations in the
Right. So from FY18, we reduced it by $12 million, and that was then reflected in the fiscal realignment plan submitted by the governor.
And where was that taken from? What was cut?
So what was cut at that time, most of that, because it was in the middle of the fiscal year, was postponing or ensuring that we did not spend what hadn't been spent yet if it wasn't in our core operation. So that included the delay of the pre-kindergarten expansion. In last budget, you gave us the authority to move forward with a further expansion of the pre-kindergarten program. So we had not started that construction for the renovation of the facilities to enable that.
How much is that realized?
That is $1.1 million. Half of that was for the facilities, and half of that was for the curriculum, the teachers, and so forth, to get them started.
And what other things did you postpone?
We took all the other funds. So, for instance, textbook funds, library funds, healthy future funds. Even it didn't mean that we didn't spend in those areas. We were able to dedicate most of that to just core operations, which is mostly on your utilities and contracts that are already existing. We targeted the reduction in utility costs. That's been of 10%, which has been much more of a challenge, because even though we track reduced consumption, the rates have not reflected, have not yielded savings for us over that time period. We have made a lot of progress in reducing contracts. Part of that does put pressure on the school system. So, for instance, in our custodial contracts, we've reduced the scope of our custodial contracts, but that, presents challenges at the school sites. If solid waste contracts, if things are not being picked up, the same frequency that they were picked up before, then we get complaints from the school. So we have achieved savings in that area. We were targeting about $1.5 million in contract reductions. We're looking at we froze vacancies in the central office and school admin to the tune of about $2.2 million in those reductions. And then we were looking at delaying the onboarding of substitute teachers until the beginning of the fiscal year, yielding $700,000 in savings. All in all, it amounts to about $12.1 million in reductions in savings. I could produce that. I mean, that's just a memo I think we've shared before, but we can certainly do that again.
How have your cash receipts, what's your allotment? I mean, your weekly.
So right now we continue to get 3.75. The way we're tracking it, and I'll ask our deputy if she wants to clarify, but the way we're tracking it, we should be able to. We are getting. So the allotments we can't necessarily use as to measure whether we're getting the cash, because the allotments are not being held back. So we typically are seeing a gap in how much cash is being released based on when we need it. So right now, based on the allotments, we've received 80% of the cash, but we're tracking toward the end of the year to meet that target of $12 million in reductions from our appropriation. So there hasn't really been a cash issue. I think we've worked that out with DOA. It's about $3.75 million a week that we're getting.
So you will be reduced. The amount that cash that you will have received by the end of the fiscal year, you expect to only be short 12 million? I mean, to be short 12 million, is that correct?
Right, that's what we're targeted for. So I think that's Okay, so I guess we have an upcoming meeting with DOE to reconfirm, but based on the latest information that we are tracking towards an appropriation that will be cash that'll be $12 million short of the appropriation.
And how have you managed to do without that 12 million in cash?
Well, all of these reductions and savings were targeted, not as a full year savings, but really targeted towards that point in time when we made the decisions to cut and reduce, and then we calculated out through the rest of the year. So that $12 million, we wanted to make sure was a real number that we could attain with those measures in place. So I think as we've lined up the cash that we're receiving, worked it out with DOA to make sure that is steady and that commitment remains steady, that target of $12 million in reductions can be met. Now, it just means that we've postponed a lot of issues to hopefully be able to deal with in 19, but if not, some of those reduction in savings may continue depending on our appropriation.
There was on page 4 of your narrative, you talk about transfer authority. What kind of transfer authority were you going to be suggesting or asking for?
I'm sorry, repeat the question, the transfer authority?
Yes.
So in the past, the legislature has given DOE a lump sum budget, and in prior budgets it had done so with certain parameters on transfer authority. So I don't believe we had that same restriction this past year, but in prior years there was a restriction on being able to transfer out of personnel into operations, but not necessarily back into personnel. So at the end of the day, what we do ask for is the ability to manage the budget subject to the overall appropriations level that the legislature sees fit to grant.
Has the board made the decision on the start date for the school year? Is there going to be a delayed start?
Yeah, we're still in discussion. I do know that phase 2 and phase 3, we haven't taken that off the table, not knowing where we were going to stand in terms of the overall budget. And so I do know that we've had our discussions with our stakeholders, and that's a decision that we'll have to sit with the superintendent as we continue on down, getting closer to our end of fiscal year. So that is still on the table, but it's not something that we've fully explored at this point.
It's June.
Right. Yeah. So right now we are still planning to open the school year on August 10th for teachers and August 14th for classes. What we did do, just in preparation, we sat down with the teachers union to go over scenarios in which we would delay the school year until October 1st. Now, obviously, when we had shut down everything in the summer and teachers were no longer present, we're really dealing with 12-month employees, and that's something that's a little bit more straightforward to manage. But when it comes to teacher pay, it offers some complications, as you're well aware. The Supreme Court issued its decision on the furlough issue that happened many years ago, that allows us to pay teachers based on the school year and preserves the authority for the board to set that school year. But if we were to set the school year on October 1st, one of the concerns, I know Mr. Sharma is in the room representing the union, one of the concerns of the teachers was that a start date on October 1st might present a gap in pay between the initial planned start date of August 10th to October 1st. So when we started to evaluate the cost savings, so for instance, phase 2 was supposed to yield $2.8 million, and that was further reduction in contracts, further reductions in substitutes, freezing salary increments, and extending the hiring freeze to all schools, which is going to be more of a problem. But phase 3 was when we got into delaying the school year. School started until October 1st, and that was really we calculated as a $1.1 million savings. But that's only because of the savings we would achieve by not hiring limited term employees such as substitutes, limited term teachers and any sort of school year employees, but it doesn't answer the question of whether or not teachers get paid. So that $1.1 million actually reflects teachers continuing to get paid on August 10th, even though the start date of the school year was October 1st, because I think one of the things we wanted to do was try to manage it so that we didn't put on our educators this burden of having to go 2 months without pay. So but it's something that is kind of tricky because you're paying them at the start in August, but they're not reporting until October 1st. So we kind of fleshed these issues out. We didn't have to implement it or have not had to implement a delayed school start, but we have worked out some of the details and some of the concerns that would emerge should we have to go that route. So
what would the savings be by doing that?
So right now it would be all the savings would all be pushed off into the savings would all be 2018 because of the gap because of not paying teachers. If we didn't pay teachers until October 1st, you'd pay them the same amount for that school year, but it would all be in 19 and not that portion that would normally be paid at the end of 18 for the start of the school year. So that's not a decision we've made. I'm just saying it's one of the complications we've been discussing with the union. I think because we felt that we didn't have to implement that delay, that we would just put that question on the table if we got to it, try to figure out what would work based on the availability of resources that we had to run the school system.
As long as we're talking about the union, you did sign an agreement earlier this year, is that correct?
That's correct.
And in that agreement, there's a requirement to hire 65 new positions.
So I'm just trying to get the right. Yes, there are. Well, based on the collective bargaining agreement. We included in those positions in the request, and so those are a total of about 77 new positions at about $2.6 million in costs. And those include school aides for ESL and SPED, as well as library clerks, clerk typists, nurse clerks to support the nurses, and then library techs. So we have, again, $2.6 million of that is attributed to the collective bargaining agreement.
How many of those positions are currently filled or in the process of being recruited and filled by 19?
Those are all new positions. Those are all positions that were not currently provided in the existing staffing pattern.
Okay. What's the account balance for the First Generation Trust Fund as of today?
What's the 300? So I think the last count was around $200,000 to $300,000. How much? It's 200,000.
200,000. Because I believe it's next year that we start having to pay it out, isn't it?
Correct, and I don't believe we received. Right, so we haven't received, for instance, payments from GCC and UOG this past year. Right?
You have.
So we're not fully where we were supposed to be in terms of the appropriations and the payments into the trust fund. So we're not where we need to be.
Would you provide the committee with a status report on your third-party fiduciary? Where are we with that? I saw in the papers last week you sent off your official request.
So we've been working this past year to get that official request in and do some preliminary work with the U.S. Department of Education and the third party. So last November we met with Phil Maestri, and we gave him the heads up that this official request was going to be made this year. And we talked through the progress that had been made in the department. We got to hear some of his concerns and questions, most of them revolving not simply around the progress that's been made, but around the sustainability of that progress beyond, once the USDOE starts to relax those parameters. So we did that. We also committed to providing them with a draft letter so that they could review and give us input before we finalized it. So in April, prior to that, early, I think it was March, we were able to give them the draft document and for their review, and then we went in April to meet with the U.S. DOE officials. So we were able to meet with, we had the Secretary of Education involved in that conversation, the deputy secretary in charge of operations and in charge of risk management, Jason Botel, was also involved in that conversation. Phil Maestri, their deputy general counsel, Phil Rosenfeld, as well as a couple of their program people, and then we also had staff from Congresswoman Berdalio's office attend. So we had maybe 2 or 3 meetings really around that letter coming, and we wanted to make the argument that, number one, we had made progress based on the requirements set forth in special conditions. Number two, we expressed our frustration that despite the progress, they keep issuing this annual letter to document the special conditions for the upcoming grant, which did not reflect any change since the inception of these special conditions, and that we'd like to see that at least acknowledge the change. And then number three, we asked for the flexibility to begin to work on transition structure that we had started to already talk about with a third party. That transition structure, if we have the flexibility within this budget, which was done in January, we were discussing this in April, would be a matter of us constructing an internal unit that would reflect the responsibilities and functions of the third-party fiduciary that as it exists now, and then to move that third party into more of a monitoring position in the near future, so that we could distinguish between the progress that DOE has made in terms of its operations, processes, and personnel, and not have it sort of mingled with the third party's work. Because every time we went to US DOE and said, we're making progress, look at the audits, look at the documentation, they would come back and say, well, that's because you have a third party. And we say, well, we're doing 99% of the work, and they're stamping it at the end in some cases. But I think that confusion and that lack of visibility has really, hindered us. So we pressed the case. I think we got some, I think there were definitely some people around the table, the program folks. The program person, who is now the assistant secretary, spoke very highly of the progress that we had made. She had actually been on island in September, and we were able to take her around to different programs. The deputy general counsel smiled in acknowledgement knowing that he's the one who drafts these special conditions letters, and they're like boilerplate language. And he was he expressed the appreciation that we made that case. But we won't know until later this month whether that letter of special conditions will be changed. And we're hoping that it will set the path for beginning the transition work associated with the third party. So we issued that letter, I believe last month, so that they needed the official letter to begin the balls, the gears turning at US DOE and the bureaucracy to start the process of what exactly is going to happen. We continue to have bi-weekly calls to apprise them of continued progress. And I think Bill Roberti from the third party will be here later this month, so we can sit down and flesh out what that transition structure will look like in terms of what DOE will hire, how that will work, and what third party monitoring activities will be, so that we can bring that and share that with the US DOE, what we're hoping next month. So we will find out whether there are any changes to special conditions. It's usually issued before July 1st. So we were told to get our comments in before the end of May, which we did. And then we're hoping that gives us the flexibility needed to begin, this coming year to start to make those changes.
In the last paragraph of your budget narrative, you mentioned that the operational and financial obstacles to successfully manage public education are the result of public school systems' arduous statutory and policy requirements limiting management's ability to maximize resources crippled by the dependency on local government operations.
Beautifully written.
In our notice to you, we asked for recommendations on legislation that you wanted to see considered by this body to relieve you of some of those arduous management? Do you have them, or
Right.
will you provide that later?
So, yeah, I think in your letter you referenced any suggestions to make statutory change, and you referenced the potential amendments to the 14 points as, as seeking our input on. At this point, as I reviewed the 14 points, the language itself is very general. I mean, except it sets the bar high, yet without specificity. So when we come to the legislature and we're asked to align our budget in ways that meet the mandates, such as providing a healthy, safe learning environment, it's very broad, but it gives us an opportunity to clarify what resources are going to be aligned with the safety of the schools and so forth. So it's not specific enough to tie our hands, but it does set a mandate where we feel that we have an obligation to ensure that any of these requests that are coming from the schools and our divisions are forwarded to the legislature for consideration. And so I think, in review of that statute, to me, it was pointed out by Senator Klitsky that I could be, liable and the focal point of a lawsuit if I fail to notify the legislature or BBMR or GDOE of the obligation to fully fund the requirements of the law. So I've kind of reflected on that over the past year as I've been beaten up in certain ways for coming and advocating on behalf of DOE during the times when you were considering both the tax options and the further reductions to government. But we maintain that as long as that is the law, then we are bound to continue to align our requests by those mandates until such time as those are amended. At this point, I don't know that I could find a very straightforward way to amend any language in the 14 points, because the 14 points again says things like we have a certified teacher in every classroom. We know that we have certain issues with filling every classroom with certified teachers, but the answer may not be to amend that law, maybe to figure out how we're going to resolve the certification question, and so on and so forth down the line.
So just so that it's clear to everybody, the budget that we're discussing today was passed by the board on January the 26th. Right. And that was in the midst of or just before the legislature went into its series of sessions to address a fiscal crisis in February and March. And at the end of all that session, or during that, you were asked to take a 10% cut in the FRP. And you've managed to be able to absorb that cut and operate for the last 5 months with that reduced amount. But you're still now here with asking for a budget that really is $112 million more than what you're currently operating with at this point. And I just want my colleagues to understand that it's because you believe that the 2% sales tax is sufficient to be able to carry and cover that. I don't want to put any words in your mouth, but yeah, I just want you to try to clarify it to them, because as you put it, you know that we're thinking about repealing. But if we repeal that, it'll affect your budget. Not only just the regular budget, but the additional amount that was going to be. So I'm just asking. So
to clarify, every budget we send has typically been about 40% more than we actually receive in appropriations due to the requirement, I guess, to fund the rest of the government. So we understand that, but again, based on the mandates that we have and the input that we get from our stakeholders, we produce this request for the consideration of this body. Number two, you're correct that this budget was generated in a time prior to the discussions about the impact of the federal tax cuts. That actually, the very first word I had with regard to the targeted amount of reductions came the day of the vote. And we said, look, we've got this word, but we have just finish this up, transmit it to the legislature, and then we'll get to work on adjusting to this FY18 impact. Now, what the legislature came up with the governor in terms of 34-87 helped us, first of all, to deal with FY18, because I think the issue is you're in the middle of a fiscal year. It's very hard to make quick adjustments other than like we did, which was postpone any spending that had not been commenced, to just freeze that spending, which was what we did. But otherwise, we're in the middle of operating the school year. It's very difficult to try to unwind some of that spending, whether they're contractual, related to employee pay, and we talked about furloughs and how long that would take. There was just not enough time. So right now, as we move into 19, we're saying that we recognize that the legislature has been looking at the 34-87 and has been looking at the tax increases that occurred out of that discussion. We haven't taken a position, the board or myself, on whether to increase taxes, whether to repeal taxes, and how much those taxes ought to be if they are going to be implemented. What we've said that coming out of this, out of 34-87, is that we can plan for FY19 based on what comes out of this appropriation, based on the resources available to the entire government. And number two, that dedicated source of funding presents numerous opportunities for us that I think would benefit the school system as a whole for the long term, as well as be an investment in the economy versus an operational offset, which much of the other tax increases were meant to address. So I think right now, whether the legislature repeals the tax or not, what we're saying to you is that let us know how much funding is going to be made available to the public school system, and let us know if we're going to have a dedicated source of funding to help fix schools. And based on what you give us and what the governor approves, we'll move forward. Now, I do want to say I do like the notion that was presented in 34-87, which said look at the entire government and prioritize education, health, and safety. I think the onus was placed on the governor at that time to restructure government in that way. But I believe the legislature has the same opportunity in prioritizing the appropriations in the same manner to prioritize education, health, and public safety, and then see what else can be afforded. So we come to you with that frame of mind, knowing that the tax policy is going to be very difficult and complex for you to decide. But we were very pleased that we at least had some certainty as to how the budget would be able to move forward into 19, and that we would have facility support.
But that 334 was if we were going to be at the $1 billion mark.
Right. It was before any of this discussion about reductions took place.
I'll have the oversight chair and then the vice speaker.
I'll ask later.
Okay, vice speaker.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here. It's really, I first want to commend that on successful school years and many achievements that your schools have made. Some of you pointed those out in your graduations, and I want to also commend you on some very beautiful and inspiring graduations, and those were very nice. So thank you for all your efforts. I also want to commend you for taking the lead in the Mes Chamorro celebrations this year, and I thought those were very beautiful and full of joy. So thank you to all the principals who worked very hard and all the teachers on that and the Division of Chamorro Studies. As for the budget, I guess the detail of the 12 million savings that you're operating under right now is very important to me. And I know that you've promised the speaker to submit more detail on that. You said you weren't really able to reach the savings you had anticipated in utility costs reduction. But I'm more curious on this. You had promised to freeze assistant principals, limit overtime, limit CTO, that it had to be used instead of paid out, freeze resignation, reemployment, and delay reclassifications. But if I look at the budget, I mean, and then again, I know you prepared this budget before you submitted these cost reduction plans. the budget seems to have an increase for substitute pay. And I guess I want to know is, are we not able to fill those with teachers? I mean, because, yeah, I see that in your cost reduction plan, that's what you're trying not to use the money for. But anyways, it seems like there's an increase, $12 million in salaries, an increase of just $118,000 in reclassification. So this must be just a very limited reclassification, not.
Right. So what's helpful, again, with the flexibility that's been given by the legislature, if the needs, fluctuate and we find more, reclassifications that are required, then we can, play with the budget to fund those and make sure those are funded and not have to come back and seek more funding. But this, again, the budget document is a planning document and was done before the reductions, but it is planning for the full, complement of teachers that we anticipate, and then we work with the principals to also try to anticipate what reclassifications might be coming in that fiscal year and so forth. The substitutes we try to fund at a 10% of the of classroom teachers.
Well, it looks like it's 1.6 million, which is 99% higher than your 2018 on-call substitute requests or appropriation. And then there's a...
Telling's indicating that is based on the
right.
10% substitute level that we try to support.
All right. And then there's a $22 million increase in equipment. $22 million.
Is that the textbooks? Yeah.
So part of it is the textbooks, and part of it is our schools are asking for collateral equipment.
What textbooks? Did you say?
So right now in the budget, you'll see the proposed budget. You'll see 17 million for textbooks.
For what?
For
Sorry.
textbooks.
Oh, okay. And you include that under equipment.
Right. Generally, textbooks are classified as equipment.
I thought textbooks had a separate a separate appropriation.
There is a separate appropriation. It's usually between 1.5 and 2 million.
But you're asking for 17 million in addition?
To meet the mandate.
Okay. So this is new.
No, I believe it was in last year's budget also.
Okay. So if I could explain the textbook number really is to meet the mandate, and it reflects the textbooks that have already been adopted by the Guam Education Board, and then supports those textbooks at a textbook per each child anticipated to require that textbook. So as you're aware that sometimes the textbooks that are bought are a class set instead of one for every student. And so I think when we made the request, it was to calculate how much would be needed if we were to fully fund all the adopted textbooks at a level of one per student in that content area or grade.
All right.
Recognizing that that it's not typically able to fully fund that amount.
All right. Textbooks, am I correct that was another item that in the realignment plan that you had proposed to put on hold for FY18?
Right.
Correct?
So yes, and I think with everything that hadn't been spent at that time was to put it on hold, and then we're currently looking to see whether we'll be in a position with the FY18 budget to support any purchases before the end of the fiscal year.
All right. I don't know. The budget request that was submitted in January has significant increases in almost in many, many categories. Contractual, $37 million higher? And I guess that's why for me, and a lot of these things you had in your fiscal realignment plan put on hold. So I guess we just need, I want to know the detail of why the increases are so high here, and what we would be foregoing if you had to operate under the fiscal realignment plan amounts, I guess. And so I guess the details on the fiscal realignment, where those costs really are coming in. And so may I ask then, you're continuing to operate under the fiscal realignment cost cutting of $12 million, and part of this was also to save money on the Tizen headquarters. Is that being are these all being implemented, or only some of them?
So right now, that was not. So letters were sent to both the legislature and the governor seeking an opportunity to utilize that facility for other purposes if it was deemed appropriate or beneficial. We did not receive any follow-up or responses in terms of following that up, and probably because of the law that was passed. We since have been paying for this facility, at least the government of Guam has been paying for this facility, and we had to make a determination as to whether or not we were going to proceed to occupy that facility now that the occupancy permits have been coming in. So during that stage, my priority was to move the receiving warehouse and the other the folks and the presence down in PD up towards Tizen, so we could determine whether we could utilize the PD property to support DOEs in the future through some type of lease. So that right now is occurring. The receiving warehouse is being relocated. And then the other priority was to address the special education department, which is right now occupying half of Chief Brody Elementary School. The board has asked us, following the request of the Tamuning mayor, to determine whether we can use that facility and convert it to a middle school. So those opportunities are presented by moving SPED and moving the warehouses out of PD. And that's going to happen. I think the entire move is going to happen by the end of the summer. So that's with Tizen headquarters. So some of those things were put on the table at the time. We are going to have to work with the legislature for the necessary authority, for instance, to lease the PD property, and for other items that are on that list. But I just sent the details on the savings to the speaker and to your.
So what is it? What does it detail for cost savings for the Tizen headquarters? How much is being saved, or none? That's what I mean. How are you making your 12 million if what you propose to cut is not being cut? I guess where did the cuts then end up happening? So
basically, what's happened is that we counted on the cuts that we could definitely count on, right? Things that were not pie in the sky numbers. So again, phase one included delaying pre-K, redirecting funds that were set aside for textbooks, libraries, healthy futures, limited gaming to support core operations, reduce utility costs and contracts by 10%, delay reclassification, freeze vacancies, delay the onboarding of subs until October 1, 2018. Phase two included the postponing the purchase of the SPED buses.
We're just on phase one, though. You never went to phase two, right?
We never went to
right.
So right there is 12.1.
If we could just get back to phase one, I just want to clarify. Now, the senators provided me a list of what I'm looking at your cost containment austerity measures in narrative, and this one is a phase one reduction savings 12.1 million details. So I just want to ask you, did you make this planned savings in these areas, or did you have to make them in other areas? Because if, for example, if you didn't save on the Tizen headquarters, so where did that money then come out of?
So basically what's happened is phase one, so the Tizen headquarters is more of a revenue generating idea. So those were not costed out and applied to these costs.
Okay,
so
all right then.
But on the 12.1, like for instance, I think the biggest area where we're not able to achieve as much savings is utilities. I'll be straightforward with the fact that we've been holding off on hiring as much as possible. So at the end of the school year, your principals will tell you that some of their vacancies that are coming towards the end of the school year have not been filled. But now that we're approaching the beginning of the school year, we have to figure out how we're going to be able to fill those school-based positions given our budget expectations. So those types of things are, we're allowing us to be as conservative as possible.
All right. Well, part of this was delay onboarding subs until October 1, and then required charter reductions by 700,000. So were those implemented?
So DOA was responsible for that part. So what I understand is that DOA reduced or either BBMR and DOA worked together to reduce their ability to have that cash provided at the tune of $700,000.
All right. Finally, just want to know, when you send this correspondence with the US DOE regarding the third party, am I understanding that in order to create a unit for the transition, we might be doubling the costs or at least increasing our costs for an interim period? And do you expect any cost savings when that transition is finally made?
Right. So we estimate probably right now that we could fund a unit probably about $500,000. We're looking at maybe funding a unit at about $500,000 or less if we can. But I mean, it really, so what's happening is that we've got this contract for services that's been costing about $3 million.
Yeah, so we pay $3 million to the third-party receiver, and then $500,000 for your new unit.
Right. So what we're trying to do is, I mean, if you at the most conservative level, you'd be paying $3 million plus the $5 million, so it'd be an additional spending that we would have to figure out whether local or federal funds can support, our transition structure. That's something that we still want to discuss with GDOE. But really the intent of it is to step back the activities of the third party and to tailor their services downward so that they're mostly doing the monitoring. So that means, reflecting how they're staffed, what their monitoring responsibilities would be, how many times they're come in, and how they support with the on-island team and so forth. So we're hoping to take their side down to reflect their new sort of, or their monitoring responsibilities more than fully executing the fiduciary role.
Are you hoping to do that soon, or now it's sounding later? I thought that
no,
was
we're
going
working.
to.
So we believe we need the authority from GDOE. In our past conversation, they said, well, you don't necessarily need that clear authority. We think we do, but that's why we put the official letter in requesting the specific language to allow us to do this. And then when we go in July, we want to determine, whether there are limits on doing that. But what we like to do is get started this fiscal year in setting up that structure and affecting the services of the third party. And we hope we can achieve that savings in this fiscal year.
For reducing the services of the third party.
Correct.
But definitely not removing the third party this fiscal year 19. Doesn't sound like that's your plan.
Right. We would like to, however, it depends on GDOE's response. So again, what's very unclear and which we brought to your attention is we don't believe they're clear as to how exactly, what exactly their next steps are in terms of the validation. So at the most favorable light, they would say, okay, we got your letter. We're going to come in September. We're going to do a thorough review and we'll let you know in October or let you know in November. That'd be great. We get a sense of where we are, make the necessary changes. In some discussions that we're having with them, they say, well, in order for us to be really sure that you're going to get off, we want your internal auditor to do a validation. Then we would like the third party's comments on that validation. Then we like to work with their public auditor. Then if you hire an extra consultant to oversee their validation, we like their comments too. And then we're going to have the risk management and general counsel and inspector general review all of these things. So we've heard, two different versions of how this is supposed to go in our conversations. We're trying to clarify and streamline that validation because it doesn't make sense that we're going to have to go to 10 different validations on the same standards to exit. That's the fear that we have, that once we get feedback, they make this very bureaucratic trail from here to the end that will then thwart our abilities to, again, get the special conditions removed as well as the third party.
All right, thank you for clarifying that. Thank you.
The Vice Chair of the committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and good morning, folks, and to all of your administrators in the public hearing room. Just a couple of points and questions. First and foremost, thank you very much for your extensive presentation with regards to reiterating the 14 points of adequate education, because Mr. Fernandez, you mentioned a little earlier that the students do have an option available to them to sue the Department of Education. Just looking at your numbers, I was wondering what I guess my question as it applies to the 14 points is what are the individual variances between what the Department of Education right now is presently expending versus what your requested amount is. A good example is under certified teachers, administrators, guidance counselors, health counselors, and allied health professionals, you're requesting in your budget $160 million. And then my question would be, what is your existing variance between current expenditures versus what the requested amount is? And that would be, you can provide that information to the chair, because it would be good information to know and to understand in terms of moving forward and providing some additional review of your budget. Also, another thing, Mr. Fernandez, thank you very much for reiterating the need for a lump sum budget, because in this particular case, as was evident in fiscal year 18, the flexibility that was given to the department was very, very helpful in terms of you being able to continue the school operations with minimal interruption, but also having that flexibility to move resources around within the department. So thank you very much for asking for that additional provision. The other point I want to mention is we talk about, I know the chairman brought up about the 2% sales tax, and it continues to bring back questions about, are we really prioritizing the funding and the operations of this government? And I say that because the Government Priorities Act of 2018, which was in a previous legislation and it was inserted as a provision of Public Law 34-87, now requires that the funding of the government of Guam prioritize education, public safety, and healthcare. And based on information that has been publicly shared through the media, when you have ongoing operations incurring an additional 200 plus hiring of personnel outside of this department, hiring of personnel that obligates this government on an annualized basis of approximately $6 million, and of that, based on information shared, we only have 3 individuals that were hired under the priorities component. Guam Police Department, 3 officers. That brings into question whether, in fact, the provisions in Public Law 34-87, which requires reorganization, which requires that, in fact, we prioritize education, public safety, and healthcare, whether that is really being carried out to the letter. Because otherwise, we should see a very active approach, understanding the limited finances that we have, and hearing from the superintendent and for the chairman of the board that you need additional resources to adequately fund and operate our school system based on the 14 points, incidentally, which is public law. So that really eats away at me in terms of how are we going to ensure that you get as much of the resources that you're requesting, in addition to something that Mr. Fernandez brought up a little earlier. This legislature passed a provision that requires that, in fact, should any outstanding protests be completed and resolved, that the Guam Department of Education now have the full responsibility of the procurement for Simon Sanchez High School. And because that was a recent action of this legislative body, empty promises should never, never be considered as part and parcel of the entertainment of the budget. So we need to, Mr. Speaker, find the resources to begin setting aside these funds so that GDOE can proceed with the procurement. And we broke it up into different phases so that he can go with the architectural engineer first, get an estimated cost of what the new Simon Sanchez High School would cost the people of Guam, and then eventually proceed with that. So there's some mechanism in there to allow for budgetary flexibility. And Mr. Speaker, I certainly hope that that is and will be part and parcel of this budget consideration as we allow the Guam Department of Education to be able to own up to that. Because the reconstruction of Simon Sanchez has been far too long in the waiting for many of our students, especially the parents and the alumni of Simon Sanchez High School. Now, just looking at the budget, Mr. Superintendent, and I'll close with this because I brought up a number of concerns, and it really comes down to streamlining and prioritizing this government, because we no longer have the flexibility and the luxury of going out there and spending money as if, in fact, it's falling out of the sky. That is a concern, and we need to be able to contain costs in this case. And I'm glad the Speaker highlighted at the beginning of his statement of looking at zero-based budgeting, because that concept should apply to every other agency outside of education, public safety, and healthcare. because it is already in Public Law 34-87 that those 3 areas within our government should receive the priority of funding, and then the other components will be part of the consideration, and we need to come up with making some tough decisions of streamlining and reorganizing this government so that we can provide education, in this case, the resources that you need. So, Mr. Speaker, I look forward to further deliberation on the budget, and in addition to the operational requirements of GDOE, we also have made a commitment, this body, this legislative body, that we will find the resources to allow the superintendent and GDOE to proceed aggressively with the reconstruction of Simon Sanchez High School, and I look forward to that being part of the fiscal year 19 budget. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to first begin by expressing my appreciation for the board and for the superintendent for not getting overly involved in the current tax policy debates. As you can see, there is another agency that is far overly involved, and it's resulting in a situation where their financial circumstances are being heavily scrutinized, and I don't think that we need to put the department through that. I appreciate the board and the superintendent knowing where the lines are. I think that that's the way for us to move forward as a government. There's several items that I wanted to just discuss here with respect to your testimony, Mr. Superintendent. When I look at the chart here listing the 14 points of the Adequate Education Act, these amounts here, this is for us to be able to comply with the Adequate Education Act for the full fiscal year. Is that correct?
Yes, our request is aligned to express the fiscal year cost for meeting those mandates.
Now, my first question is with respect to item number 13, 180 instructional days. If items 1 through 12 were what we needed to provide all of those services for a full fiscal year, why do we need an additional $22 million to comply with the 180 instructional days line item if all of those previous categories should already be covering the full fiscal year?
So basically, the 180 instructional days reflects a lot of the mostly administrative overhead. So I think everything else can be addressed. These are school-based, school-level, or school servicing costs. The 180 instructional days includes myself, for instance, as well as our management team, who do not, who share our services across all of the other items, as well as some of this, almost a catch-all, but we look at it as administrative overhead, and we review it from the standpoint of whether for a $334.7 million request, whether a 5 or 6% overhead is excessive or not, reflecting that there are some central office functions that support. So payroll, personnel, so those types of functions that you would typically associate with the back office operations are there.
My only thing is that, we do that for more than just 180 instructional days, don't we? We do that throughout the whole school year. So
Correct.
Why is that being categorized under the 180 instructional day adequate education line item?
It's because now that graduations are over, the first day of the school year ending, we're here to support the 108 days of learning by testifying in support of our budget. We have a lot of school readiness activities that go on over the summer. We have summer school, all of those types of functions that don't end when the school year ends. So a lot of these issues are really reflecting the services to the schools, and then there's a central office function that we continue to support. You're right, beyond the 180 days, but in support of ensuring that we're able to operate during the school year.
I just want to be clear. I'm not against the central office or anything like that, but I'm of the impression that this 180 instructional day line item of the Adequate Education Act was just to ensure that we were teaching students for 180 days. So if we're going to be categorizing budget items under that, they should be with the intent of complying with that 180 instructional day specific requirement, and not using it as just an object category to stick the central office into.
Yeah, we're open to discussion. I guess the way I look at it is that, for instance, our payroll staff help ensure that when their teachers come in, over the summer, they're working during the summer or over the school year, they're able to provide that teaching and learning and get paid for it. But we can discuss, I don't know where else, how to categorize those other functions, but we could also share it out like that, but that's a little bit more complicated calculation. So if you give us more time, we could think about doing that.
The other issue that I wanted to discuss with respect to this listing here is the, like for example, the textbooks for every student at 17 million. I know that in a previous years, and we've been talking about some of these things for years, in prior years, it was discussed that the useful life of a textbook order is about 7 years. And so one of the reasons why the appropriation was closer to 2 million as opposed to the full 17 million was because over a 7-year rolling period, we should eventually get to a place where we're only spending 2 million every year to constantly replace the set of books that is getting stale dated. And I wanted to contextualize that fact with these figures in the context of whether or not we can, instead of, you know, we come to these budget hearings and we look at these numbers, it's $334 million number, and immediately I'll tell you, the reaction on this side is we don't have that, and the reaction on that side is if you don't give it to us, then, you know, we can pretty much wash our hands of why we're not accomplishing what we're supposed to in terms of our mission. And we kind of just go through that same cause and effect type of discussion every single year. But if there's a way for us to phase into this so that we can fund it and you guys can get to a place where you are getting those resources at some point in time in the future, then we can all, you know, look our community in the eye and tell them that, you know, we got to where we're trying to go. So while I appreciate the hard number of 334 million staring us in the face, the reality that we're not going to get there, I think shouldn't just be the end of the conversation. I think what we need to start talking about is how do we get there? Like, what's the phase? If DOE was to come back with a phase-in budget and say, this is what we need now to operate on your zero base, if we want to get to an adequate education standard over a 3-year, 5-year, or 7-year period, this is the kind of investment that we're going to need to start looking at phasing into over these years. And that way, if we can adopt something like that at this level, then everybody can look forward, including the board, including the, you know, the administration. We can look forward to saying, hey, you know what? Yes, things aren't exactly where we want them to be, and yes, adequate education still has a way to go, but we know when we're going to get there. And if we had done this, I've been here for 6 years. If we had done this, you know, when I first got here, if we had come up with like some kind of 5-year plan or a 7-year plan to get to this point, we'd be having a different conversation today. So has the board and has the administration developed a phase-in approach that we could somehow try and come to terms with?
Yeah. You know, as the chair of Budget and Finance, I appreciate that comment because I think definitely that's what we're moving towards. I do know that we're working with the superintendent in terms of a strategic plan and how to tie that into the finances of the Department of Education. And I think that understanding the financial condition we're in, I think that comment that you made about phasing certain things, and definitely we'll take that into consideration. And I think moving forward, we'll be able to provide something that provides a phase-in opportunity so that we can adequately meet. But I think the reason why we put the numbers out there is based on the law, and there's comments that has been made in the past. If you don't ask, we won't know. You know, that's from the other side of the table. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we're putting it out there. We understand that, you know, the financial constraints, but whatever the dollar figure that comes to us, we appreciate the flexibility, number one. Number two is the department then will develop its own spending priorities. And since I've come on board and taking over the role of chair of the Budget and Finance Committee, we basically identified the areas of safety, curriculum, and our facilities. And those are the areas in which we kind of marshal the resources that has been identified by the legislature to the Department of Education. But we heavily rely on the superintendent's guidance in terms of how the budget will be spread throughout the department. And so being also a part of the PTO at one of my children's school, I know that the budget was formulated at that level and brought forth. So what we're looking at, these are the numbers that have been vetted through our stakeholders. And when it comes to the board, we definitely look at, you know, ways to kind of enhance, you know, or maximizing the expenditure of our authorities. And I just want to point out that we've actually come to the legislature also saying we're willing to help ourselves, and that's why we keep asking for, enabling legislation that will allow us to have some revenue-generating ideas like PD. We've addressed that issue. I think that would be able to generate some revenue, and if we can streamline that towards textbooks, then we can have that continuity of fund that we won't have to rely on whether or not, the cash flow coming into the government. And so, point well taken, and I definitely, I'll go back with my colleagues, we'll look at that and look at a phase-in program, probably 5 year, looking out 5 years projected. Thank you.
Thank you. And the reason why, Mr. Chairman, I think that, I'm not a big fan of a multi-year budget on a broad stroke with respect to the government, because the overall revenues are very hard to predict. But with the Adequate Education Act, we have a very clear mandate, a very clear goal, and perhaps a multi-year budget specifically for DOE to help us work towards that goal that's very clearly mandated, I think would be a win-win for the legislature and for the departments, that we can have we can know where we're going and how we're going to get there, as opposed to the department being the biggest component of the budget, kind of becoming the victim of revenue realities every fiscal year. And that's, we all know that's what's going on. DOE has the lion's share, and when things get tight, DOE takes the biggest hit. But if we have a multi-year approach that's tied to adequate education, then we can insulate the agency, because then it's starting to work towards what we all envision education to be on this island. I just wanted to raise one more point, and that is with respect to the concern about the funding for Simon Sanchez and the Territorial Educational Facilities Fund. I think you're aware of the news that showed that we did not receive $40 million that should have gone into that Territorial Educational Facilities Fund. Now, when these taxes, the TEF is funded by property taxes. When these property taxes aren't paid, DOE doesn't get its money through the Territorial Educational Facilities Fund. How would the department feel if we were to introduce legislation that would place a lien on these properties and assign that lien to DOE, so that DOE would hold the lien until such time that the property taxes and the penalties are paid? And if after so many years of it not being paid, DOE can sell the lien for the taxes and penalties due, and whoever the investor is that's buying the lien from DOE will have title to the property. Would that, we got to figure out a solution for why, otherwise, the lack of collections and property taxes is always going to hurt the department, and there's not going to be any kind of mechanism to compel those revenues to come in, and we're going to be sitting here 5 years later with a $40 million hole in our pocket. So would the department be willing to take on that extra component where the liens of any unpaid property taxes would be assigned to the department, and the department would be the ones to either collect on those funds or sell the liens after a certain number of years?
Senator, you commended us earlier on being able to draw the line between advocating for the 14 points and removing ourselves from tax policy. So we'll leave that to you, but our focus is on what revenues will be available over what time period. I think, just like with TEF, we're not involved in the collections. We just try to monitor and work with DOE and BBMR to try to get a handle on what's being collected and when something will be available for Simon Sanchez. So, we anticipated that because the RFP had already been put out there, there had been some kind of funding guarantee that would have supported that RFP. When as we've been preparing to, once this court dismisses and OPA does what it needs to do, in doing our due diligence, we just said, look, tell us how much funding is available so that as we develop our solicitations, we can certify that funding is available. And once the word we got back is that there is no funding available. So however we work it through TEF or other sources of funding, we're happy to just make sure that we understand and can certify that funding is dedicated to help with Simon Sanchez. But I don't know the details of that proposal. I'll be happy to look at it at the right time.
Well, and I think it's important to clarify, I'm not going to turn you guys into a collection agency. But there's a very distinct difference between collecting on property taxes and actually holding the lien. And what I'm suggesting is that DOE holds the lien. Revenue tax will still be responsible for collecting it, but what we can do is we can craft policy where after 4 years you hold the lien, and after 4 years if it's not collected on, you guys can go out there and sell the lien to an investor, and they'll be the ones to have claim to the property. You guys get your money, and the reason why that needs to be considered is because in the end, the tax revenue that you're not receiving is an asset. And if that asset is not received by the department's not able to fund itself based on the appropriations that we've assigned to it. If you're not going to get the asset in cash, then you're going to have to get the asset through the property taxes that go unpaid. And perhaps if we set up a system where that's actually going to be happening, DOE will either, one, get its money through the selling of the liens, or two, people will actually start paying those taxes. And we won't have this situation where, you know, we have $40 million going uncollected because one agency isn't doing it and it's not causing a consequence to them, and they're able to have that kind of control to the detriment of the department. If we let the liens get assigned to the department, you guys will control the asset. And so that's just a suggestion I want to put out there. If it's not something you want to get into, then we may be seeing the same kind of TEF problems in perpetuity until such time that we figure out how to resolve it.
I appreciate the creativity and potential solution to the challenge we face, and I think that's what we're looking at. If you look at the 14 points, it's really the funding stream behind it, you know, and you're taking from the general fund. But whenever we can have identified funding streams to help supplement or support specific programs within the department, of course, I know my colleagues and I will stand behind, you know, such proposals. I think, you know, just looking at the resources that's spread throughout the government, how do we maximize it? But if this is an opportunity for us to explore that, I'm pretty sure there's going to be a tremendous amount of conversation and, you know, from the community in it. But I think it's worth exploring in these times of you know, the financial situation that we're in. But I think once we identify that that funding stream can come through and it's earmarked specifically for that purpose, then, you know, of course, it will start to shave off on the other areas that is relying upon not a steady funding stream. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Nicholas brought up some sentiments that were also expressed at a prior meeting with a prior budget hearing with the university, and they were also expressing some ability to move around their finances and to have the discretion to do that, lifting of some of those restrictions. But insofar as DOE is concerned, I found it quite astounding, the governor's ceiling in his budget submission for DOE versus what DOE actually computed. And that has most to do with your desire to fully comply with the Adequate Education Act, right? Is that in some why your amount is so much more different from the governor's ceiling in his budget? I think there's a discrepancy of about $76 million.
So, no, we're aware of the governor's ceiling. You know, as typical line agencies would do, working with the governor's office and BBMR, they would, I guess, all receive a mark to, you know, in terms of their budget requests. So DOE is not included in that. In fact, we submit our budget directly to the legislature, and so our budget request is guided solely by the 14-point mandate and our discussions with our stakeholders. Mm-hmm. We understand that the governor, of course, always sends his budget down, typically with a mark for DOE, but that's not, you know, usually there is a wide gap between what is being proposed versus what the DOE proposes. Usually,
yeah. I mean, few million, but, you know, when it comes to that, it's a bit disturbing. But what I want to ask you, though, is DOE in a position, much like UOG presented, where there are grant opportunities that require matching funds, and that if you had the ability to match certain grants, that you could actually realize more revenue? Is that something that's available to DOE, or have you exhausted all federal grant opportunities as far as you're aware?
So right now, most of our federal grant opportunities are, of course, with the U.S. DOE, and then we also have Head Start with Health and Human Services. So with our DOE grants, for special education, for instance, we are required to have a maintenance of effort, which in which we are funding for special education services on the local side will be scrutinized on a yearly basis, and we have to maintain, we can't go lower than that level of effort to maintain our special education funding. With a consolidated grant, it's not necessarily a direct match, but it's more about looking at the supplementing versus supplanting requirement for the consolidated grant. So we typically are always inserting, with our budget, requesting that local, funding to be able to demonstrate that we are not supplanting our local mandates, but we are trying to supplement. And then I think beyond that, though, I don't believe we have any existing. Does Head Start have a grant? Sorry. Thanks for the correction. Yes, there's for food services and for under USDA as well as Head Start, there is a match. But I think you might be referring to other discretionary grants to apply for, and I don't think we've encountered that. But we certainly, with USDA coming in, we've been looking at what the terms might be to be able to leverage that kind of support. So we were very glad that they came on island to talk about, because I know UOG and GCC have been working with USDA for a while. We want to take advantage of that, and that might involve a level of local either funding or structuring to make sure that they're able to support us.
Okay. With regard to your children with special needs that are in the DOE program, with your full budget request, does that also contemplate adequately servicing and educating those children with special needs who may require not only an aid proportion, but enhanced equipment to facilitate their learning, like electronic devices or the like? Is that contemplated in that number?
So there are a number of issues associated with our special education program. Well, the biggest one is that it's been flat funded for the most part for the past few years. And what's happened, and we noticed during the Competitive Wage Act implementation, those employees employed who are federally funded also receive those increases. So with that flat funding in place, we saw that our ability to support the same number of personnel became difficult. So in the past, we've been able to carry over some funding from prior years to be able to support, those employees. But employees like one-to-one aides are supported by SPED. We asked in this budget for additional positions to serve as one-to-one aides. Now, I think we asked for at least by 40. So a total of 80, so 2 for each school, to enable us to meet the anticipated number of students who require aides. Now, involved in that conversation is when we hire them locally, we hire them on a full-time basis. We don't do a part-time. So there's also this discussion of how we hire our one-to-one aides, and should we be moving towards a full-time model, and can we afford it? We do know there's much more benefit of having full-time aides who you can train and invest in, who don't turn over so quickly because it's a part-time opportunity. So if we're able to support more full-time aides that can do one-to-one services, but also when school is out or during the summer also provide other supports, but be on a full-time basis, that would be helpful. So other than that, I do know that we have, that do the SPED grant, where we try to utilize that for equipment and other services. We do have a shortage of key professional services that I think you're well aware of. So the specialized positions and professions, sometimes it's very difficult. So physical therapy, occupational therapy, those types of areas we continue to struggle with. Speech pathologists and so forth. So that's an ongoing need. So we may have the funding, but may not necessarily be able to find the personnel. So we've been looking at virtual services or virtual therapies being used, virtual therapeutic services as a supplement to our full-time personnel that are hired under the SPED grant. So with the budget request in hand, we did definitely put in those needs for more one-to-one aides, but on a full-time basis, and that would at least resolve one of the biggest challenges for us with SPED.
And is that demographic of special needs students growing, or is it a steady number or an average number?
We're finding it growing. So what you typically want to do is, through early diagnosis and services, see the trend start to go downward as the students get older, and you try to place students on a path towards more independent, especially living when they graduate. So we try to see if we can get them early and make sure we provide them the services needed early. The challenge is that, as we've seen most categories start to decline, we're seeing, at least the last time I looked at the data, a growing number of students diagnosed with autism. So autism, I know that I know that you're focused on that issue, and many providers, but autism seems to be the growing population that we need to figure out how we can service and prepare to support. So that's really the demographic or the category that we're seeing grow, while others seem to be stable or maybe slightly declining.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Senator Nelson, and then Senator and the Oversight Chair. Oversight Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. John, Mr. Superintendent, God, I had a whole bunch of questions, but everybody's been asking the questions, so it kind of answers most of it. But on the issue of, you have it listed on page 4, reference to the solar panels, and you also have it listed on page 16. Appears that GSA is not entertaining you, huh? And finding ways for you to reduce your utility bills. Maybe that may be something similar to what's going on with, or how we had gotten the law passed for you to take over Simon Sanchez. Maybe you may want to send me something that we can introduce so that you can, there's a lot of things that DOE needs to take control over when it comes to procurement. And that might be one, because my understanding that you could save quite a few $1 million, and you could put that into your capital improvement plan that you have. You also have, earlier this year, you mentioned about ROTC folks on contract, where you're saving monies from increment and so forth. You also have your deputies that are supposed to be, are they all in contract, your deputy superintendents? They're unclassified?
Unclassified, no one's on contract at this moment.
But if I'm correct, I think by law they're supposed to be. And
they may be, yes.
I just want to make sure they're getting protection, because there's only 2 current deputy. I think you have 1 acting. Okay, and then another issue I was concerned about, we talk about certified teacher. Based on this budget of $137 million, you're talking about if it was all filled with a certified, not a substitute, not an on-call, not just somebody that just graduated, correct?
Yes.
And how much have you been spending for this year? What has the record been? Because I know you don't always get all your budget, okay? Remember, I was on that side of the street before. But I'm just concerned is that on many occasions, you remember we had that oversight, or the round table, we talked about, and it being that we got our principals here, and it's great, I like to hope that they'll commit to you that when you don't have enough teachers, their vice principals who are teachers will be in the classroom, and not find 4 or 5 classroom of students in the cafeteria, and 3 or 4 vice principals roaming the campus when they could be covering those classrooms. Okay, so
with regard to solar,
okay.
We have 2 opportunities for solar. One is with the lease schools, where we work directly with the landlord, and the landlord then is able to go and solicit for a provider of the solar services, right. And then our role is to enter into a power purchase agreement with that landlord. So right now we've been working with GDOE for over 2.5 years on a power purchase plan and we're working with the Attorney General's office to get that plan approved. That plan has been both signed off by both the department and GDOE. It's been signed off by GPA, by the PUC, I believe, and then it's been with the Attorney General's office for, I would say, 2.5 years. And we've been working with her to have that released. Now, she did indicate recently that she was willing to move it forward, and I think the concern is, it's a long-term, it's a 20-some years of power purchase agreement in which we contract at a rate, a kilowatt-hour rate, and then there's I think a 1% escalator. After 6 years, it begins to escalate. So right now, we've negotiated down to, I think, a very favorable rate of 16.5 cents per kilowatt hour. We have after 6 years, it begins to escalate at 1%. So over the 25-year term, we would still, maybe at the end of 25 years, we would get to where we are today in terms of what we're paying. And so I just think that there's some concern about whether or not we can predict what the energy environment will look like in a few years, and whether our contract puts us at some type of loss should the energy markets turn upside down. So our response has been that we're only talking about 4 schools out of 41 schools, so that should the energy world turn upside down and you see a lot more savings coming from your utility providers versus solar, I think 37 of our schools would make up for the cost that might be associated with the 4 schools that are under contract. Furthermore, we put in an exit clause that would allow us to buy back and finance the buyback of those solar panels should there be a need to exercise that once the landlord recovers costs. So we think we've negotiated a pretty good deal. We think the board stands behind it. They've been pushing me to work with the Attorney General to get that done. So we hope to see that shortly so we can move it to the governor and start to implement. I think the vendor is relying on federal tax credits that are still in place, and I think that would help us test and see whether these 4 schools can generate the savings that we anticipate. I know that GPA is working on its own solutions, but we also know they're building a new power plant, and so we know there are costs associated with it, so we don't anticipate our power rates going down anytime soon. So we hope that we can show some savings with these 4 schools and then use that to do more. Now GSA has responsibility and authority to procure solar panels for the remainder of our schools, the non-leased schools. I believe there was earlier discussion by the legislature to transfer that procurement or do something with the procurement, at which point when they heard that the legislation was introduced, they decided that they wouldn't move forward any further with it, and that's been stalled for about 3 or 4 years at this point. So we are now way behind the Catholic Church and other institutions in terms of implementing. When you think about institutions implementing solar power, we're way behind, and we like to at least try it out so we can demonstrate not just power savings, but demonstrate what sustainability looks like to our students, that we're trying to showcase what kinds of fields they might be interested in when they graduate. So that would be an incredible opportunity for us if we were able to move forward.
Right, and I like how you mentioned the AG's office are, after 2 years, right, they want to move forward. She's also moving out. Okay, I rather prefer that you just give us the information you need, and we amend the law so you can take control, so you don't have to wait for GSA for another 2 or 3 years, because I don't know how many of them are going to be left there after this election. So I just want us to figure out a way to help you. We just move on. I know it's GSA, but when the administration changed, there may be a change. And I'm being very, very positive for DOE. So, Mr. Superintendent, just provide us the information. Okay. Let's help you move on, okay?
So on ROTC, you mentioned that. So yes, just to clarify for the legislature that it is our move right now to place incoming ROTC instructors to hire them on a contract basis and no longer as classified employees. And so what we find with most of our senior instructors who've been with the department for so many years, they come in and they enter as classified employees, and as a result, we will split costs half and half on their salary with the military and their support for the ROTC program. That 50-50 split changes as these instructors are given increments over time. So the longer you've been here, all of a sudden we're paying 67%. The military is paying the remaining 33%, and we end up shouldering the burden of those costs. Under a contract arrangement, we would just maintain the 50-50 split, going forward. But right now, we're kind of in the middle of that transition. We have some who are classified. We have upcoming retirements. We have about 5 instructors who are now on contract. So we have to move, slowly but surely towards that goal of just trying to make sure that we pay them reasonably, but certainly not excessively, given the limited resources we have.
Another area, because the principals are here, maybe that may be something to consider also for some of your principals that I know that are due to retire, and they'd like to actually stay on, but they might prefer to go on contract. That's something you may want to consider, okay? And that will reduce your costs because they'll be set. Some of them are like, yeah, I want to retire. I'll get a contract. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Can always rely on Senator San Augustine to give us a good laugh. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I sit here a little bit troubled this morning because, perhaps because I'm new at this, but through this budgetary process, there's been a lack of acknowledgement that fiscal year 2019, we are going to have a $100 million shortfall. And that's not just with DOE, it's with a majority of our agencies. And now we have before us a repeal of the sales tax, which was also anticipated to cover a lot of costs of the government. So, Mr. Superintendent and the board, I want to implore your help that if this does become a reality, this $100 million shortfall that we face in the government, that we work together to be proactive and find solutions so that the children are not impacted. I don't know why people are not speaking about this. This is very serious, and I'm very concerned. So I hope that we keep this in our mindset, and if that day should come, that we are already prepared. Okay, that's all. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I just want to, yes, we do acknowledge the financial situation, and we pledge to work with the legislature as it considers the budget request to make sure that whatever the solution is or whatever the outcome is, we are doing what we need to do to operate our schools and put the priorities of the students first. So as long as we can continue that dialogue, we anticipate we'll always be there to work together.
Could I just ask you one more question, Mr. Fernandez? The Office of the Superintendent's budget increases by $2.2 million. It says in miscellaneous. Could I ask what that is for?
Ma'am, which schedule are you looking at?
It's under the Office of Superintendent.
Which schedule? Or sorry.
Miscellaneous. Oh, I don't know. I wrote it out in my notes. Central Division? Central Ops, Central Division, Office of the Superintendent.
Do you have that?
I don't see a page number. Superintendent 05, if that's a page number. Yeah, that's the page number.
If you could hold, we'll try to.
It's under Central Ops. That's the merit bonuses?
That's merit bonuses for the prior period, for the prior fiscal years.
How many fiscal years? Because last FY18 was 296,000, and now it's going up to 2 million.
Between 2014 to 2018.
None of those have been paid? Merit bonuses, you're saying have been held?
They're all on hold.
They're all on hold due to the CWA, but we've been booking them just to track the merit bonuses. So none of them are for the superintendent's office.
Well, that's where they're.
But they're categorized. They're for us to distribute out when they're funded. Just want to clarify for the record.
All right.
Unless the board has something I didn't know about.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Did you wish to make a closing statement? Otherwise, we'll recess.
No, sir. We just wanted to let you know that we understand the financial situation of the government, and we appreciate, the work that you guys are doing to find a way to get us into give us our FY19 budget in light of some of the decisions you have to make. So we just come before you today to present the budget, to remind you of the 14-point mandates that we are being held to And then to let you know that if anything, if you're able to, this $10 million in dedicated funding for facilities can go a long way to resolving the issues that we're having with our facilities, and we look forward very much to trying to take advantage of that to address all of our schools. So we thank you for listening to our request today.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And this budget hearing will now recess until this afternoon at 2 when we meet with Comisión Divino Zamoro.